ecosystem. It's a community of plants and animals. But what we see at the surface is only part of the picture. In an ecosystem, everything is related, and those relationships have evolved over thousands, even millions of years. We use the resources of ecosystems. We need the resources they provide, and so we are also linked to the organisms that call these natural places home. Over time, some members of the ecosystem disappear, and new ones come in. These are changes that have taken place at nature's pace. The system had time to adjust to the loss and the gain of new species. That is, until we started looking at ecosystems with an eye for change and began introducing organisms into waterways beyond their natural range. Introducing aquatic organisms into new areas is a widespread phenomenon that takes many forms. While some species are shipped from distant places, others are carried to a nearby drainage. Some are introduced for economic reasons, some for recreational pursuits, and some are the unintended result of our activities. But no matter what the method, the distance, or the purpose, a species that gets into a waterway as a result of human activities is a non-native species, an aquatic introduction. The Chinese first introduced aquatic animals. About 3,000 years ago, they domesticated the carp and began placing them into rivers throughout the country. By the Middle Ages, Asian carp had been introduced in Europe, first in monastery ponds where the fish became a food source for monks who didn't eat red meat, and eventually into natural waters throughout the continent. Across the Atlantic, it was barely 100 years after Columbus arrived that the first foreign fish were introduced to the New World. Goldfish, a relative of the Asian carp, were planted into North American waters in the mid-1600s. The first large-scale aquatic introduction to North America came in 1872. Again, it was the carp, brought from Germany to Northern California by a businessman with a dream. Julius Pope was an entrepreneur who hoped to raise carp and sell them across the country. He was sure Americans would come to love carp as the Europeans did. Only 5 of his fish survived the trip, but that was all it took. Carp are hardy, and these 5 were ready to breed, and breed they did. In no time, Pope began selling hundreds of his carp to farmers everywhere. Thanks to the railroad and fish transport cars, carp were soon raised in ponds throughout the country. But before long, spring storms and flash floods washed carp out of their ponds and set them free in America's rivers and streams. They adapted quickly to the wild. It wasn't long before they could be found in almost any suitable body of water. But in less than 20 years, many saw the carp introductions as a huge mistake. Americans didn't take to their taste as Europeans did. Anglers complained the fish were bony and hard to clean, and carp were also unpopular for the damage they did to natural ecosystems. To feed, carp suck in a mouthful of mud, insects, clams, and other invertebrates found along the bottom of a waterway. They spit out the mixture so the particles are suspended and then suck in the food. In the process, they stir up silt and mud, making the water cloudy and lowering the visibility. The habitat becomes less suitable for other fish who need clear water to find their prey. As the problems created by carp became more apparent, agencies began looking at ways to get rid of the fish. In a number of states, seining, trapping, and even adding toxins to the system have been tried with little success. It seems carp are here to stay. This practice of taking a species and planting it into an area beyond its normal range continues today. Since the lessons learned from the carp introductions, it's hoped all introductions are well studied and well planned. But sometimes they're not. Sometimes we don't even know we've introduced an organism until it becomes a nuisance. Probably the most dramatic example of our time has been the accidental introduction of the zebra mussel. A small mussel from Europe's Caspian Sea, it most likely arrived here in the ballast water of a ship. Since its discovery in Lake St. Clair in the Great Lakes Basin in 1988, its numbers have exploded. Within a year, colonies of 30 to 40,000 per square meter were found in Lake Erie. By 1994, zebra mussels had spread to all of the Great Lakes, throughout the Mississippi Valley, and east to New York's Hudson River. And as they've spread, zebra mussels have left a path of serious problems. The little organisms can attach themselves to any solid surface, including each other. In some places, they've been found in layers 8 to 12 inches thick. These layers have clogged intake pipes of industrial facilities, power plants, and municipal water suppliers. In the short time they've been in this country, their damage has cost millions. The potential ecological impact of zebra mussels is equally dramatic. Each mussel filters about a quart of water a day, feeding on microscopic organisms, organisms that are food for small fish who are eaten by larger fish and eventually humans. Given their voracious feeding habits and their tremendous numbers, zebra mussels have the potential to alter entire ecosystems and disrupt aquatic food webs. While the ballast water introductions are an unintentional result of human activities, other organisms are introduced into our waters on purpose. Often, the reason is simply to add a species in hopes it'll survive to produce something that's desirable to a group of people. However, in the zebra mussel example, introduced species are not isolated from the community of plants and animals they now share a home with.
All introductions change communities. Whether that's bad or good depends upon our perspective of the function of those communities. It does bring change. They are different, and then the consequences have to be weighed through time as to how that new community can function and what that does to the previously existing community.
While we know a community will be affected by an introduction, it can be difficult to accurately predict what those changes will be, including any potential negative impacts. Flathead Lake in northwestern Montana is the largest natural freshwater lake in the western United States. In 1916, kokanee salmon were introduced for sport fishing. Their numbers increased dramatically over the years.
By the 1950s, there were so many fish spawning on the shoreline that after they died, after spawning, these fish die after spawning, and there were so many dead carcasses on the shoreline that they had to be collected and carried away in a dump truck in order to make the areas suitable for people to be around.
A landlocked form of the red salmon, kokanee generally lived for 3 to 4 years in the lake and then spawned either along the shore or up McDonald Creek, one of the lake's tributary streams. As the salmon population grew, so did the number of anglers. Flathead Lake became one of the most popular fishing spots in the West. But the kokanee boom was a phenomenon destined to change when another non-native species, the tiny opossum shrimp, or mysis shrimp, was introduced into the Flathead Lake Basin.
Mysis shrimp were introduced into lakes upstream from Flathead Lake, where kokanee were also introduced previously, in an attempt to elevate the populations of the kokanee and make a more viable fishery for people to harvest. Unfortunately, water flows downhill, and gradually, and after a period of several years, the mysis showed up in Flathead Lake and established a population here. And like most exotic species, this little shrimp became very abundant in Flathead Lake in a matter of just a few years. I think we first found it in the lake around 1981 or 2, And by 1984 and 5, the numbers were up to about 120 mysis per square meter of the surface area of the lake. So they just exploded in numbers.
Meanwhile, biologists were counting the salmon migrating up McDonald Creek.
Well, this is a typical bar for red salmon to spawn on.
In some years, more than 100,000 salmon made the trip. The highest number recorded was 400,000. But in 1987, something went wrong. Only 330 salmon made it to the creek that year. The next year, only 50. And while anglers had been taking up to 200,000 kokanee a year, not a single kokanee was caught in 1988 or 89. The Flathead Lake salmon population crashed, and it hasn't come back despite restocking efforts. University of Montana researchers found two problems in this complicated situation. First of all, kokanee and mysis were not at the same place at the same time.
Kokanee live in the upper layers of the water column of this big, deep lake. They don't go into the deep layers because it's too cold for them. The mysis, on the other hand, are adapted to living in the deep layer. I have a layer of mysis right here. They were at about 68 meters.
Mysis do come up to the surface to feed, but only at night, and they return to the lake bottom during the day. But kokanee only feed during the day, so when it came time for the salmon to eat, the mysis weren't there. A second problem was in the food supply. Kokanee eat zooplankton, tiny organisms that drift in currents, and so do mysis.
That gave the mysis a distinct competitive advantage because they could feed on the zooplankton very effectively. Their population grew to large numbers very quickly, and almost before we knew it, they had eaten the entire food supply of the kokanee salmon.
The effects of the shrimp introduction were felt throughout the ecosystem. Flathead Lake and its tributaries had become a gathering place for a variety of animals who had one thing in common: they ate salmon. Bald eagles were among the most prominent. Hundreds gathered along McDonald Creek to eat dead and dying salmon. But when the kokanee population collapsed, the animals who had come to depend on salmon as a source of protein either disappeared or declined dramatically. Most introductions are made with the best of intentions. Most are based on perceived social or economic needs of the day. And sometimes well-planned and well-run introductions can make a positive difference. Some of the benefits include an increased food supply, recreation, and pest control. But in some cases, the needs of the past aren't necessarily the needs of the present or the future. And what we're learning is that while the intentions of past introductions were well-meaning, non-native organisms can create unforeseen complications in natural ecosystems. In one type of introduction, a species is added to a community in the hopes that it'll control or eliminate an undesirable species. It's a type of introduction called biological control. For example, mosquito fish are used as a biological control species in rice fields where mosquitoes can be a serious health problem.
Mosquito fish are not a cure-all. It's not a panacea. It's an effective tool, and if used properly, it can be a very effective biological controller of mosquitoes. But like all introduced species, we have to be very careful and very concerned that we use it in the right way.
In the desert Southwest, mosquito fish introductions have threatened native species. Along the Colorado River, the Gila top minnow flourished until mosquito fish were introduced. The top minnow population is now on the brink of extinction. One reason for the decline, mosquito fish eat young top minnows. In some areas, top minnows have disappeared within 2 years of a mosquito fish introduction. It's a similar story in Arizona. Mosquito fish are one of the several species that have been introduced into desert pupfish habitats. Since these introductions, the number of pupfishes has rapidly declined. Ironically, some of the species mosquito fish are helping to eliminate also eat mosquito larvae. Both Gila top minnows and desert pupfishes, if left alone, are quite effective at mosquito control in their natural habitats. Another reason for introducing species beyond their natural range is to develop or improve a fishery, either the game species themselves or bait for game species. Today, anglers may try their luck on bass, crappie, catfish, and many others hundreds of miles from their native streams. In fact, more than 1/4 of all the freshwater fish caught by anglers in the United States are not native. But what are the effects of these introductions on the receiving ecosystems? Introduced species interact with natives in a number of ways. An introduced species may breed with a related native species. Apache trout were abundant in the streams of Arizona's White Mountains, but when introduced, rainbow trout bred with the native Apache trout, the native population plummeted. Hybridization can affect the fitness of the native species. It has a more difficult time coping with environmental stresses. In the case of the Apache trout, where once they occupied 600 miles of streams, today they can be found on only 30 miles. California's state fish, the golden trout, nearly disappeared when brown trout made their way into the Kern River system. The golden trout couldn't compete with the larger browns, and they were easy prey for the newcomer. Largemouth bass are another predatory game fish that can impact a native species. Largemouth bass are native to the Mississippi River drainage and the southeast, but they've been stocked outside their native range for sport fishing, more than any species except perhaps the rainbow trout. Bass are a great fighting fish and fun to catch, but that aggressive instinct means trouble for native organisms that haven't evolved to deal with this newcomer. Bass are good predators and competitors, and their introductions have been linked to the decline of many fish now listed as threatened or endangered. Historically, fishery managers have given people what they wanted. They've stocked and restocked ecosystems with the desired species. But success has often led to increased expectations for more and more fish. Yet today we understand that some of these introductions have led to a decline, and in some cases even a complete loss of a native species. And the loss of even a single species can make a difference.
It's important to have many different life forms, not only for the multitude of functions that they provide, but also for the functions that they provide that we aren't aware of. We don't know everything about our world, and we don't know everything that these species provide for us. And actually there are probably organisms in the environment that are vital to our very existence.
We know that natural ecosystems support human life by providing purified air, fresh water, soil production, waste disposal, a supply of nutrients and energy, and the high quality of our atmosphere. So while it may be tempting to add our favorite game species to waterways everywhere, we don't have a clear understanding of how our actions will change ecosystems that all living organisms, including humans, depend upon. Direct introductions aren't the only way non-native species enter our waterways. Some organisms find their way by escaping from holding ponds or aquaculture facilities. One escape route is to ride on the crest of a storm or flood.
As we saw very plainly from Hurricane Andrew and from the recent Mississippi River floods, that things don't always stay where you think they're going to stay or where you want them to stay.
Some species escape by swimming through unscreened pipes in aquaculture facilities or during transport. And sometimes they've been mixed up with other species being removed from a pond. Tilapia, for example, are native to Africa and parts of the Middle East. They were originally introduced into North America as aquarium pets. Today, the tasty fish are grown commercially for food. But tilapia have escaped from holding facilities and entered natural waters many times. In warm water states like California, Arizona, Florida, and Texas, escapees have successfully adapted to the wild. Some tilapia species are very aggressive and compete with native fish for spawning sites in space. They may dig holes to spawn and in the process uproot plants and increase the silt in the river, which can destroy the nests of other fish and lower the visibility. Adding to all this, certain tilapia species can breed every month, and because the parents guard them, the young have a high chance of survival, resulting in explosive populations. Many aquaculture facilities are careful and follow precautions to prevent species from escaping and entering adjacent waterways. If all the facilities use the same care, the problem of species entering natural ecosystems as escapees could be virtually eliminated. Often, established non-native species are organisms imported for the aquarium trade. Some have been released by home aquarium owners.
Kids, just dump that fish.
Although people's intentions may have been good when they released their pets, these introductions haven't been without their adverse effects. Goldfish, for example, have been found in the waterways of nearly every state in the Union. But the pretty little fish can revert to their wild state and develop voracious appetites. Feeding mostly on aquatic plants, goldfish can remove significant amounts of vegetation. They increase turbidity and contribute to the decline of invertebrates living in a community. Introduced plants can also pose problems. Hydrilla is an aquarium plant that was apparently introduced in Florida, presumably by individuals cleaning out their home aquariums. Native to Asia, hydrilla flourishes in the wild. Once established, hydrilla grows quickly. The plant has taken over 90% of this Florida lake and covers large areas of other lakes in the region. It clogs waterways and has become a nuisance to navigation. Since its introduction, hydrilla has spread throughout the Southeast and beyond to California, Iowa, and Virginia.
The reason why exotic species take off and explode, it's because they come over without the system that provides the natural checks and balances on the population growth. In other words, these species have adapted to predators, competitors, and diseases in another ecosystem. And when they're transferred to a new one, the rules of the game are different. As a matter of fact, it may be that the new ecosystem doesn't have a way to check its population growth. And when that happens, the aliens become pests.
Bait bucket introductions are another way individuals have transplanted fish into America's waterways.
Yeah, toss this bait, throw it over. Sure. Won't be any good
An
tomorrow.
end-of-the-day bait release is presumably how red shiners showed up in Nevada's Lake Mead. The red shiner is a popular bait fish native to the Northeast, but sold as live bait in some areas of the West. Once in the lake, the red shiners traveled up into the Virgin River, and with the shiner came a parasite. The Asian tapeworm found its way to North America when Asian grass carp were introduced. And while shiners have been able to adapt to the effects of the tapeworm, the native species in the Virgin River have not. The wound-fin minnow in particular is now an endangered species, partly because it's not able to deal with the effects of the Asian tapeworm. At Klamath Lake in southern Oregon, Oregon State University researchers are monitoring another bait species, the Flathead minnow.
The Flathead minnows are a species of the family Cyprinidae, which are native to the eastern and Midwest states of the United States. And they have been brought out west as people moved out west, either as for use in fishing as bait fish or to feed the fish like largemouth bass and crappies that they've brought out to raise themselves from the Midwest. They were first captured in Oregon in the late 70s in the Klamath River south of the city of Klamath Falls. And they were first collected in 1982 here in Upper Klamath Lake by Oregon Department of Fish and Wildlife. Since 1982, they have become the most abundant fish in Upper Klamath Lake.
Not only are the number of minnows increasing, they're also spreading to other waterways, leaving researchers wondering what the effect will be on two native suckers.
I'm seeing a lot of larval suckers. Some laboratory experiments by some local biologists have indicated that, at least under laboratory conditions, the fathead minnows will attack and kill and eat larval suckers. Whether that happens in the wild, we don't know the answer to that yet.
But one thing seems clear. Once an introduced species establishes a successful breeding population in a new ecosystem, there's almost no way to get rid of it. And as we've seen, introductions often threaten the cornerstone of an ecosystem, biodiversity.
It's like the analogy of the watchmaker and the person that tinkers with the watch. If you lose parts of the watch won't work anymore. And with the ecosystem, it's the same way. All of the parts are important. And for the whole ecosystem to function, it needs all of its parts.
The story of aquatic introductions isn't simple. There are benefits, there are costs, and there are impacts that we don't yet understand. The aim in aquatic management is not to try and return to the pristine environments that existed 500 years ago. We cannot undo past mistakes. But by carefully researching proposed introductions, we can better understand the system and the species we want to introduce. We can evaluate potential impacts and benefits of the introduction, both short and long term. Only then can we make informed decisions about non-native species.
To learn more about this topic and other OSU Extension resources, visit the web at extension.oregonstate.edu/TV.